Hi. Well, Sandpoint is very dear to my heart and my memories. It's where I spent 6 years of my life with the Navy. I started out at 18 years old. I decided to join the Navy after I thought about what was going on over in Vietnam. At first, I wanted to join the Marines when I was 17 years old, and I wanted my dad to sign the waiver so that I could join before I was of age, and he wouldn't do it. And he himself had served in the Navy, and his dad signed a waiver to let him join the Navy at 17, but he didn't want me to join the Marines with what was going on over there in Vietnam. Although I wanted to, I believed in what we were doing, fighting the communists and stopping the spread over there. But when I turned 18, I was determined to join the Marines on my own. Just waited the time out. But then I had a dream. I had a dream I had to kill someone. And I woke up in a sweat and felt sick to my stomach, and I said, you know what, I don't want to do that. So I took my dad up on his offer, and he drove me down here to Sandpoint, which I never saw before. And I came up over the hill on 65th and saw the base laid out in front of me, along with Lake Washington. It's a beautiful view, but at that time I didn't notice the view. What I noticed was the first military base I've ever seen. That's how protected I was, I guess. I didn't, but and it looked ominous to me. It was all laid out. I saw the airport. There were no trees like it is now. In a way, you can see the whole peninsula from that height. And we drove down to the bottom of the hill, turned left, and drove to the security gate. And I remember my dad, he had told me that he had spent time at Sandpoint as a reservist after his active duty time, and then again as a civil servant. And when they stopped him at the gate and told him he couldn't come aboard, he told them, they asked him, well, why are you here? And he said, my son wants to sign up, see the recruiter. And they said, well, turn around and park across the street. And my dad muttered some angry words under his breath and turned around and says, after all the years I spent on this base, they won't even let me on. And so we went over to the recruiting part, which is right there as part of the main gate. If you look at the main gate from the street, it's just off to the right. There's stairs there so that you didn't have to enter the base. You can just go right up those stairs. So I joined, and there's a lot of detail about it. I'll be here for a long time, but I remember they asked me to come back again with my school records and my SAT test. I don't know if they called it SAT back then. And I came back, and they offered me two jobs. They said you could be a mechanic, airplane mechanic, or you could be a parachute rigger. And I wasn't very inclined to be a mechanic. And when they told me that parachute rigging, you had to rig this parachute, fold it up and pack it, and then you had to test it by jumping out of an airplane. And I knew I was afraid of heights, and I didn't want to do that. So I said, I don't want to do either of those things. Isn't there something else I could do? And he says, well, your SAT test showed that that's all we have for you. You'd have to have higher scores to have other options. And I told him, well, when I took the SAT test, I had a temperature of 104. I says, and he thought about it. He says, well, if you could take the Navy aptitude test, we'll see. So I took their test, and I scored higher, and they offered me a job of being an air traffic controller. And so I jumped at that, and then I had to wait about 3 more months before I graduated from high school, before boot camp started. And when I started boot camp, it was right here at Sandpoint. And a lot of people don't realize that Sandpoint had a boot camp. But every summer they had a boot camp for their what they call the TAR program, which is TAR, Training Air Reservist. And they had a 3-month boot camp, 2 months longer than the regular Navy boot camp, because when they trained reservists, they had to maybe overtrain them a little bit. Some of the stuff that they would learn right after boot camp, if they're regular Navy, they would learn on the job. But with reservists, they were going to be cut loose at the end of that 3-month period and wait until they got orders for a school, whenever that opened up someplace in the United States. For me, it was about 9 months later. I was, after boot camp, I was given the opportunity to go to air traffic control school in Glencoe, Georgia. I joined March 1966. And I got a lot of admiration from the teachers and other students for joining the Navy even before I got out of high school. That was pretty cool. Four other boys joined out of my class too, and one of them went to boot camp with me. That was Steve Phillips. No, Steve wasn't Phillips. Steve, might have been Steve Phillips. It's almost 50 years ago. Sorry. But boot camp was 3 months long, and I remember all of us, just kids, probably for the first time like myself, being outside of their family. It was a pretty traumatic experience the first couple of days. I remember, there's key things I remember. I remember the first day in boot camp, and I'm sure a lot of people that went to boot camp have these kinds of experiences, but standing after being shaved bald and standing in our skivvies in front of our racks and having these ridiculous drill instructors, they call them DIs, screaming at everybody, just at first to me just looked comical. I mean, I just couldn't believe it was happening. It wasn't real. And so I started to snicker, standing at attention, and the guy next to me started to snicker. And then another guy next to me started snickering, so I just burst out all-out laughter, which brought 3 or 4 DIs right up to me. And the head DI, his name was Briggs, and he slowly walked up to me as the other DIs were berating me and teaching me how to say, "Sir, yes, sir." He asked me what I thought was so funny, and I said, "Sir, nothing, sir." And he says, "No, tell me." He says, "What was so funny?" He says, "I want to know. I'm curious." And so I told him, this scene was just ridiculous, and I just thought it was funny. And he says, "Okay, good." He says, "Now get down and give me 50 push-ups." And so I was doing my 50 push-ups, and I was an athlete in high school, so 50 push-ups wasn't out of my reach. So as I finished up my push-ups, he's walking back, and he said, and I hit 50, and he had me count them out. I barely was able to get 50. And he says, "Good, now give me 50 more." And I could only do about 12 before my arms gave out and I hit the deck. And then he started helping me by pulling up on my T-shirt. Whenever I fell, he'd hold me up and I'd push. I got done with my 100. And anyway, boot camp was I spent my time here in boot camp. So I broke my leg here in boot camp, or actually my ankle got twisted around playing softball. And my last 3 weeks of boot camp was spent in a cast, which had a good side and a bad side to it. The good side was I got out of all of the things that we had to do in boot camp and had to keep my foot up all the time, and they let me sit in the drill instructor's lounge on their couch while they did things. But the bad side was I missed out on some fun things too. The fun things were getting to go to survival camp, and I heard all the stories afterwards, and I had to stay around the barracks for 3 weeks, or a couple weeks anyway, for all by myself in an empty barracks with one DI to babysit me. And the other thing was we got to take a field trip to Vancouver, BC, to watch our drill team in Vancouver, and I didn't get to go. So I missed out on some of those things. But when I got out of boot camp, I spent, like I said, 9 months before I had to go active duty. When I went active duty again, after I got out of air traffic control school, came back for another month. And then that air traffic control school was about 4 months for me. I had to stay an extra month because I didn't pass all the classes. And in the Navy, failure is not an option. So you stay there and retake it until you get it right. So, but after I came back, I had about a month of free time again, and then I was given the choice of, they gave me 3 choices for the type of service I wanted to do. The First choice was you could go in the regular Navy for 4 years, active duty, and then you could spend 2 years in active reserve. Or you could go 2 years active duty, 2 years active reserves, and 2 years inactive reserve. Or the third option was do 3 years in the TAR program, which is training air reservist, and then 3 years active reserves. And so I chose that one, the last one. And that then they gave me 3 choices of bases that I thought I wanted to go to. And I gave Sandpoint as my first choice, Alameda, and some other California one I can't remember right now, base. And I came back a couple weeks later, said I could do my time here at Sandpoint. So I did all my time here at Sandpoint at the Air Traffic Control Tower and the Operations Center. We had 4 C-54s as one of the airplanes, groups of airplanes we had. Those were transport planes that took passengers, like a passenger airplane. So we had our own little airliner that we would take reservists to various different places in the United States and around the world to do their 2-week training. And then we had P-2s, P-2Vs. They were pretty iconic. They were the anti-submarine aircraft that had 2 propellers and 2 jet engines, and they had the long stinger on the back of it. That's the iconic part. You ever saw one fly, you'd really notice the difference. That stinger was a radar, something like a radar emitter or something like that, or a sonar reader or something that they used for locating submarines. So they dropped buoys from that, and then they would be able to monitor the buoys, which the buoys had sonar on them. I guess that's how it worked. And then we had another plane called the S-2 Tracker, smaller aircraft, also an anti-submarine hunter-killer. I guess that's what they did. They went around trying to sink the subs after they located. That was their job. And let's see, what other aircraft? We had some helicopters, some jet helicopters later on. What other airplanes did we have? I know I saw pictures in some of the historical things. They used to have some of the fighter airplanes of World War II and things like that. We didn't have those. During the week, and I especially was conscious of this because I was an air traffic controller, during the week there was practically nothing going on. A plane might take off once a day or something like that. But during the weekend, all hell broke loose because the reservists came in to train, and they took all the airplanes, pretty much all the airplanes. After they mustered at 8 o'clock in the morning, by 9 or 10 o'clock, the airplanes were all up and flying, and their tarmac was pretty much empty. And so they would go out there and fly around most of the day on Saturday and come back on Saturday night and do it again on Sunday, and then park the airplanes and leave and go home for another month. And another group would come in the next week and use the same airplanes, but another group of people. So that's how they used the airplanes and trained the reserve pilots. And the reserve pilots were not probably the most proficient pilots. They didn't fly, a lot of them didn't fly all the time, and they didn't use that airplane but once a month. So as an air traffic controller, it was a little dicey sometimes. Those guys would not always do what was predictable or follow the rules, or so it got pretty busy. Actually, I heard it was one of the busier airports in the country during the weekends. Just before the base closed, there was a Whidbey Island S-2 that was doing touch and goes on our base, and then he reported that he was running low on fuel and wanted to land and fuel here. And then when he was coming around for a pass, I guess he determined that he didn't have brakes, that the brake fluids or something had so we have a short runway. And he wouldn't have had probably a problem if he went up to Whidbey Island, but apparently he didn't account for the fact that he wouldn't be able to make it up there. And when he realized he didn't have fuel, he said he needed to land here. Well, we have arresting cables that like they have on aircraft carriers that once you grab the cable, it pulls a heavy chain along and brings the aircraft to a fairly quick stop. But apparently he didn't have an arresting hook on his plane, or it didn't work, or he missed it or something, because he landed, and the field at Sandpoint was 5,050 feet, just under a mile. And it had a weird, it wasn't completely flat. It started at both the south end and the north end a little lower than it was at the middle. So it had a little incline. If you land at the south end, he was landing from the south going north, and if he landed at the end of the runway, he would have some time to slow down from the hill. But once he got to the other side, he'd probably speed up a little bit. He didn't hit down at the very end of the runway. He hit closer to the middle. And he didn't have any brakes, and he missed or didn't have the ability to use the arresting hook. So he went all the way to the north end of the runway, and we had the crash boat out there. The crash boat was always out there in case the plane goes into the water. And we thought he was just going to go right into the water. But the last minute, he turned left, dipping his wing down, and did this spin around move, came back into the tarmac and had to dodge a bunch of parked airplanes. And I guess he missed them pretty much. But after he did that, he had to turn the ground again and go north and dodge a bunch of planes, and finally went around the end hangar over there until we lost sight of him from the tower. And we heard on the radio somebody say, "Oh crap," or something. I don't know, something. He says he's going to hit the fuel farm. There's a bunch of fuel trucks over there. Apparently he missed that and went around the last hangar up here, I don't remember the number, and hit the door that was closed to come to a stop. I think he did it on purpose. And from there, that airplane stuck in the door with its tail up, with its nose in the door, a sore spot for everybody to see from Sandpoint Way, for months or years or something like that while they investigated it, and the crumpled door that went with it. So that was pretty embarrassing. It used to be where they had the children's playground out here. That's where the tower facility stood, and there was a runway off, or a taxiway, or a section where the pilots would bring their plane to what they called the compass rose, which was a painting of a compass, and it showed true north, south, east, and all that. And the plane would come there and they would come and turn their nose directly north or south, whichever way they want to do it, and then adjust their electronic compass on their airplane if there was any adjustment that needed to be made to make sure that their instruments in their airplane was actually pointing north. So that's what the compass rose was. During the Seafair, there was lots of parades and everything. So Sandpoint was very proud to have a drill team, and it was always made from the guys from boot camp. And we learned to march and drill, but those who were exceptional at it were chosen as a special team. They got to wear their dress blues and white belts, and so they would go out and perform with the rifles with bayonets on them, and they twirled them, and they would do all that and wow the crowd. And so that was a big deal, a lot of pride for the Sandpoint and our boot camp. This is a chest my dad gave me with some old treasures of his from his Navy days, and I'm giving it to my 15-year-old son. But he used to carry this around. He said when he was in the Navy, when he got moved around along with his sea bag or duffel bag, and so I've kept some of my stuff in here, old Navy stuff. This is the first thing I was handed, even before I went to boot camp. The 3 months before I went to boot camp, I had to go to every Thursday, I think it was. We had to go to a 3-hour class over here where the recruiting office is, right above. And the first book they gave us was this Blue Jackets Manual. It's a guide for how a young man should handle himself in the Navy with some basic information about the Navy. And so we were required to read that. This is basic military requirements that we had to study in boot camp. This was also something I think we studied in boot camp. Being an airman, because we're not sailors, we were airmen in the air wing of the Navy. And this was the air traffic control controller manual, one of them, that I had to study to get a higher rate. And then this I bought a couple of years ago off the internet. It's a used book, and it's called Naval Station Puget Sound, which surprised me, but I guess that's what they called it after it was no longer a naval base. It's a group history of the base, and what kind of amazed me was this is a book, it's kind of like a yearbook of all the commanders that the base had, plus some other facts that was interesting. But it surprised me that most of the commanders never spent more than 2 years here at a time. And I spent 6 years, plus another year after I was out of the Navy being a security guard, working for the federal government. I was a guard here at the base too. So I got to drive around and see all the buildings. And you were asking me if I've been in any of the buildings. I think I've been in all of them because I had to check them. And I drove around the base the way it was before they piled up the runways all in that one big pile here. So in this book they have a picture of what the air traffic control tower used to look like. You don't know if you saw that picture before. That's me. I'm running out for a pass on the lawn in front of the air traffic control tower. So yeah, the ball was in the air, and I was 20 years old. I have a lot of memories. I don't know if some are positive. Most of them are now, as I'm older, I look at them as positive. I didn't like a lot of the stuff when I was here because there was a lot of downtime, a lot of things they asked you to do or told you to do, ordered you to do that you didn't want to do. There was one bad experience I had. I'd like to talk about that. Because I was stationed here in Sandpoint, which is my hometown, and I was married by the time I was 20, I lived off base. We bought our first house over in Woodinville. And that house cost $18,000 back then. It's brand new grammar, 1,100 square feet. But anyway, I worked in my yard, building, putting in a yard and everything, and I hurt my back. And so I had one duty that I had to do on the weekends, rotated with other guys. It was color guard duty, where you carry a flag, one Navy flag and an American flag, and then two guys with rifles on either side. We performed that for the reserves coming in for their muster in the morning. And I hurt my back. So I kind of treated it like it was a job. I called up and said, you know what, I hurt my back, I can't carry that flag today. And then I came in later to my regular job that same day at the operations building, and I was met by my chief, Chief O'Mara, who was in his dress blues, and also the operations officer, Commander Davenport, in his dress blues. And I was told to put my dress blues on because I was going to captain's mast. And so I was shocked and scared. I'd never been to a captain's mast, never been in trouble before in my life. So I went to my locker, put my dress blues on, and we marched over here to Administration Building, 25, and met with the captain, who sat behind a very big desk. And I was standing in front of the desk with I think Chief O'Mara on my left and Commander Davenport on my right, looking straight ahead, answering the captain's questions. And he said, "Did you know that you were ordered to be there and that you have to obey those orders?" And all I could say was, "Sir, yes, sir." And he said, you can just say one, sir. You're not in boot camp anymore. And I remember answering his questions, and I just felt like I was so terrified that all I could see was what was right in front of me, and everything else to the side was like I was in a tunnel. And anyway, he said, well, you know, if we ask you to jump up in a hail of bullets into certain death, you know you're required to do that. And I remembered that from boot camp, so I said, yes, sir. And anyway, he must have saw how scared I was, and he meant to intimidate me, I'm sure. And then he said, well, I could have you thrown in the brig for this. He said, but what we'll do is, he decided to have me meet with the petty officer who wrote me up, which was, I think, First Class Petty Officer Jackson, if I remember right. He was in the training department, and he said, that's the guy who had to fill in for you, and he's angry. He would like to have you in the brig, but I'm going to give you to him for 2 days, and you do everything he tells you to do. So I had to go to the training department and on my days off and clean the whole place up. 2-story building 222. That's why I know that one so well. So that was one of my negative experiences. But other than that, I think I had a good time. I played on my off time. We played board games with my buddies and told stories, and we got in a lot of mischief though. There was at night, well, a lot of people don't realize it probably, that after the regular hours were over, most of everybody, the officers and the NCOs, went home. They just worked an 8-hour shift. And so it left a lot of us teenagers in charge of the whole base for the rest of the night. And there was a lot of mischief that went on. Well, my final thoughts are more of I'm over it now, but when I first came back here a couple of years ago and saw all the changes to the base a few years ago, I was upset. Because it used to be a pristine, totally flat naval air base, and that had purpose and meaning, a single purpose and meaning. And when I came here, it's like the runway was tore up, the hill was built up, stickers growing on it, all the buildings being used for various different reasons or else abandoned, and it was just a hodgepodge of different people's ideas of what they wanted to do with the real estate. And the other thing was, even 2 years ago, I was asking people that were right here, either working on the base or lived close by, and I said, did you guys know this used to be a naval air base? And not one of the people I asked knew that it was. And I asked a couple of people, what do you think those hangars are for? And they said, those were airplane hangars, and we thought they were warehouses or something. The people around here didn't have any idea that it was once a naval air base. And since I spent so much of my time here, and it was such a vital base at the time, I was pretty shocked.